Dr. Eric Rains knew this day would come, but he hadn't expected it to be so soon. He stood at the entrance of his clinic, staring at the bright red letters smeared across the brick wall like blood from a ruptured artery. Make the right choice. A threat disguised as advice. A sentence written in haste but deliberately left where he would see it. His fingers ran over the paint, feeling the rough, uneven surface beneath his touch, as if the very wall had absorbed the weight of the message. The night air was thick, heavy with the scent of the city, gasoline, fried food, the lingering staleness of rain from earlier in the evening. He exhaled slowly, his dark skin catching the glow of the streetlights, casting a long shadow against the wall. He had always known that being a black man in this city, even one with a medical degree, meant never showing weakness. Behind him, the clinic was alive with quiet movement, the muted rustle of paperwork, the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor, the hushed voices of patients waiting for their turn. In here, he was just a doctor, a man who stitched wounds, set bones, kept people alive. But out there, in the streets that never really slept, he was just another name on a list of those who thought they could stand against the inevitable. He had made his choice when he refused Alex Vega's offer, and now Vega was making his move. A sharp voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "Doc, you need to see this." Linda, his head nurse, stood by the curb, her arms wrapped tightly around a clipboard as if it could protect her. Eric followed her gaze to his car. The windshield was shattered, spiderwebbed with cracks, both front tires slashed. A deliberate act, not random vandalism. He walked toward the vehicle, kneeling beside the punctured tire, pressing his fingers against the deep cuts in the rubber. This wasn't a warning. It was a promise. Linda shifted uneasily behind him. "They came while we were still inside. No one saw anything. No one heard a damn thing." Her voice was low, urgent, laced with frustration and fear. "You can't ignore this, Eric. You have to do something." He rose to his full height, rolling his shoulders back, tension knotting at the base of his neck. "What do you suggest?" His voice was steady, but inside, something cold was unfurling. Not fear. Not yet. But the distant echo of something he had tried to leave behind. Linda hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know. Call the police?" The words hung between them, useless even as they left her lips. They both knew the answer before he even spoke. Eric exhaled through his nose, glancing at the flickering neon sign of the liquor store across the street. "You think they don't own half the precinct?" Linda bit her lip, saying nothing. Eric turned back toward the clinic, stepping onto the sidewalk, looking at the message on the wall once more. Vega was testing him, seeing how much it would take before he bent, before he broke, before he agreed to let his clinic become another cog in Vega's machine. But Vega had made one mistake. He thought Eric was just another overworked doctor, too tired to fight, too practical to resist. But he wasn't. He had spent years in war zones, kneeling beside men who had minutes left to live, stitching wounds under enemy fire, learning how to survive when death was an arm's length away. He had walked through hell with nothing but a scalpel and his bare hands, and he had made it out. He wouldn't surrender now. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and stared at the screen for a long moment before dialing. The call rang twice before a voice answered. "Jack," Eric said, his voice calm, steady. "I need a favor." Eric Rains stood motionless, his fingers tightening around the crumpled medical report in his hand, the words blurring together as his jaw clenched. The boy's name, Jamal Carter, 17 years old, barely more than a child, stared back at him from the page, the cold, indifferent ink spelling out what Eric already knew but couldn't yet accept. Cause of death, overdose. Official report, accidental. But Eric had treated Jamal himself just days ago, had stitched up a knife wound on his arm after the kid got caught up in a street fight, had looked into his tired, defiant eyes and seen the flicker of someone who wanted to get out. He had promised Jamal he'd be fine. Now the boy was dead, his body dumped behind a convenience store, the veins in his arms scorched with a lethal dose of fentanyl, the kind that didn't come from careless mistakes but from deliberate hands. Alex Vega's hands. Eric's grip on the paper tightened until the edges tore, his breath slow, controlled, but his pulse hammering like war drums inside his chest. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't bad luck. This was a message, just like the red paint on his clinic's wall, just like the slashed tires of his car. Vega was letting him know how this would end, that refusal came with a cost, that Eric's choices weren't just his own anymore. He tossed the report onto his desk, his fingers twitching with the need to do something, anything, but his phone vibrated before he could move. He snatched it up, his stomach already twisting, knowing before he even looked at the screen that it wouldn't be good. A missed call from Sarah. 3 messages. Then nothing. He pressed the phone to his ear, dialing back immediately, listening to the ringing stretch out too long, each unanswered tone grinding deeper into his gut like a knife. Sarah never missed work. Never ignored his calls. Never left without saying something. He knew the signs. Disappearing wasn't in her nature. Unless someone made her disappear. He grabbed his coat, shoved open the clinic doors, and stepped into the street, his dark skin blending into the deep shadows cast by the flickering streetlights. The city felt different now, the usual hum of traffic and distant sirens edged with something sharper, a whisper beneath the noise, a reminder that the walls were closing in. His feet carried him without thinking, his mind already locked on the only man who could confirm what he already suspected. Jack Morris looked up from his desk, his tired eyes narrowing as Eric stormed into the precinct, his shoulders squared, his movements sharp, clipped, coiled with a tension that hadn't left him since the moment he read Jamal's name on that report. Jack exhaled through his nose, running a hand over the stubble lining his jaw before shaking his head. "This isn't your fight, Eric." Eric slammed his palms onto the desk, ignoring the way the other officers shot wary glances in their direction, the low hum of their conversations faltering. "Sarah's missing. Jamal's dead. Don't tell me this isn't my fight." Jack leaned back, his chair creaking, his expression unreadable but his voice low, measured. "You think Vega took her? You think he's sending you a message?" Eric didn't answer. He didn't need to. Jack sighed, rubbing his temples before looking at him again, something softer beneath the exhaustion, the irritation. "You were a damn good doctor over there, but this is different. This isn't a war zone. This is the kind of fight where you don't get to win." Eric's lips pressed into a thin line, his heartbeat a steady drumbeat against his ribs, his breath even but his blood running hot beneath his skin. He had heard this before, had been told once that the best thing he could do was walk away. But he hadn't then. And he wouldn't now. Jack exhaled slowly, then grabbed a notepad, scribbling something down before sliding it across the desk. An address. A place to start. "If you go down this road, you don't come back." Eric picked up the paper, pocketed it without looking. "I never do." Eric Rains sat in his car, his dark eyes locked onto the warehouse across the street, the engine humming softly beneath his fingertips as he rested them against the steering wheel. The rain had started an hour ago, thick drops splattering against the windshield, distorting the neon glow of the liquor store sign flickering in the distance. He barely noticed. His focus was on the men standing outside the rusted metal doors, their movements lazy, their stances too relaxed, too confident, the arrogance of people who believed they had already won. He knew the type. He had seen them before, standing at makeshift checkpoints in war zones, rifles slung over their shoulders, waiting for orders that would spill blood. He had learned how to read them, how to spot the cracks in their armor, how to slip through those cracks like a ghost. Sarah was in there. He didn't need confirmation. He had spent the last 24 hours piecing together the breadcrumbs, her last known location, the security footage from the gas station on 8th, the unmarked van pulling away at an intersection just minutes later. The kind of vehicle used for jobs where no one was supposed to ask questions. The kind of job Vega specialized in. He had found the warehouse's address scribbled in Jack's notes, but Jack had been wrong about one thing. This was a war, and Eric knew exactly how to fight it. He pushed open the car door, stepping into the night, his dark skin blending into the shifting shadows as he moved, his body low, his breath steady. He circled the perimeter, counting exits, noting weaknesses, watching the way the guards rotated positions every few minutes, their patterns predictable, careless. The side door had a rusted lock, the kind that would snap under pressure. He pulled out a thin piece of metal, worked it into the mechanism, felt the tension shift before it gave. Silent, efficient. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of sweat, oil, and cigarette smoke, the dim overhead light casting long, fractured shadows against the concrete walls. He could hear them talking, 3, maybe 4 voices, a low chuckle, the scrape of a chair. He moved along the edges, his steps measured, controlled, every nerve in his body tuned to the rhythm of the space. A single mistake meant failure. And failure meant Sarah didn't walk out of here alive. He reached the back room, the metal door slightly ajar, the dim glow of a flickering bulb spilling into the hallway. He saw her immediately, tied to a chair, her wrists raw from the ropes, a bruise darkening the side of her face. Her breath was steady, but her eyes were sharp, defiant, scanning the room even as her captors ignored her. She was still fighting. Eric moved fast. A single step, a precise strike to the first man's throat, cutting off his yell before it could start. He caught the second before he could draw his weapon, twisting his wrist until the gun clattered to the ground, a swift elbow sending him into the wall. The third barely had time to react before Eric grabbed him, his fingers pressing against a pressure point just below the ear, sending him into unconsciousness before his body hit the floor. Sarah looked up as he untied the ropes, her breath shuddering, but her voice steady. "Took you long enough?" Eric smirked, helping her to her feet, his grip firm, grounding. "Next time, don't get kidnapped." They were out in minutes, slipping through the side door before the next rotation. He didn't stop moving until they were back at his car, the rain soaking through his shirt, cooling the heat that still burned in his chest. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a slip of paper, and scrawled a message in bold, deliberate strokes. "If you want to talk, come find me yourself." The next night, Vega walked into the clinic, his fury barely contained beneath a smirk. "You have 48 hours to reconsider," he murmured, his voice like a blade against steel. "After that, your clinic won't exist." Eric met his gaze, unshaken, unmoved. "Do your worst." Eric Rains sat at his desk, the dim glow of his laptop casting shadows across his face, his dark skin gleaming under the pale light as he studied the maps spread before him. He traced the routes with his finger, his eyes narrowing as he memorized the patterns, the shifts in movement, the weaknesses buried beneath routine. Vega's men were predictable, same cars, same times, same corners, like clockwork. That was their first mistake. He leaned back, his muscles coiled with the kind of tension he hadn't felt in years, the kind that told him this wasn't just a fight, it was war. Jack Morris stood across the room, arms crossed, his expression etched with something between frustration and exhaustion, his voice edged with warning. "You think you can outmaneuver him? You think you can win this?" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "If you start this war, Eric, there's no walking away." Eric didn't look up, his fingers drumming against the table, his thoughts a step ahead, already moving. "I didn't start this," he murmured, his voice calm, controlled. "Vega did." Jack scoffed, stepping forward, placing both palms on the desk as he lowered his voice. "You think that matters? You push him, he pushes back harder. You don't just get to play defense, you get dragged into the dirt with him." He paused, his jaw tightening. "You're a doctor, not a soldier." Eric finally met his gaze, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. "I was both," he said, his voice steady, the weight of past battles laced in every syllable. Jack exhaled, shaking his head, but he didn't argue. He just turned away, muttering under his breath. "Then I hope you remember how to survive it." Hours passed, the clinic settling into the quiet hum of the night shift, the usual sounds of distant sirens and the occasional shuffle of feet breaking the silence. Eric moved through the halls, his instincts tuned to the shifts in the air, the flicker of something wrong. And then he heard it, the creak of the back door, too careful, too deliberate, the whisper of movement that didn't belong. His fingers curled into fists, his body already moving before his mind fully processed the threat. 2 of them. The first barely had time to react before Eric's fist connected with his gut, a sharp, brutal strike that sent him staggering backward, gasping for breath. The second lunged, but Eric sidestepped, catching the man's wrist mid-swing, twisting it sharply until the knife clattered to the floor. A quick pivot, a precise elbow to the jaw, and the second man collapsed against the wall, dazed, groaning. The first recovered faster, reaching for something in his jacket, but Eric was faster, his hand shooting out, gripping the man's throat just tight enough to stop him cold. The man's eyes widened, his breath hitching, his pulse thrumming beneath Eric's fingers. Eric leaned in, his voice low, unshaken. "Tell Vega I'm not afraid." He released the man with a sharp shove, stepping back as both scrambled to their feet, stumbling toward the door, their bravado shattered. The silence they left behind was thick, pulsing with unspoken warnings. Eric watched them go, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, his heartbeat unbothered, his focus unshaken. But then his phone buzzed. A single message. A picture. An old man, wrists bound, eyes hollow with fear. One of his patients. Eric's stomach turned to stone as the message followed. "Now let's see who's afraid." Eric Rains didn't expect to see Carlos Reyes sitting in his clinic, leaning against the examination table like he owned the place, his broad frame relaxed, his hands resting on his knees, but his eyes, sharp, calculating, predatory, watching Eric the moment he stepped inside. Carlos was a ghost from another life, a name that carried weight in the streets, a man who had once stood beside Vega before something had splintered their alliance, turning them from partners to enemies. Eric didn't need to ask why he was here. Carlos exhaled slowly, his fingers tracing an old scar along his forearm, the tension in his body coiled beneath the surface. "Didn't think I'd ever need a doctor like you, Doc," he murmured, his voice low, edged with something unreadable. "But it looks like we both got problems." Eric crossed his arms, his heartbeat steady, his mind already dissecting the situation. He had spent the last few days playing defense, watching Vega's power tighten like a noose, feeling the weight of a war he hadn't asked for pressing against his ribs. But Carlos being here changed everything. Eric met his gaze, unblinking. "What do you want?" Carlos smirked, tilting his head slightly. "Same thing you do." Vega out of the picture. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his expression unreadable. "Man's gotten sloppy. Greedy. Thinks he's untouchable." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Nobody's untouchable." Eric didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't let the words settle too quickly. "You want him gone, do it yourself?" Carlos studied him for a long moment, then let out a low chuckle. "If it were that simple, you wouldn't be standing in the middle of a war zone, would you?" Silence stretched between them, heavy, charged. Carlos exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "I don't need much. Just someone who can patch me up when this all goes sideways. Someone who can keep his mouth shut." Eric let the offer settle, his fingers curling slightly against his forearm. He knew what this was, a devil's bargain, a deal made in the dark, but he also knew the truth. Alone, he couldn't hold Vega back forever. He met Carlos's gaze, his voice steady. "You get treatment. No questions asked. No payment. But Vega is mine." Carlos grinned, something sharp flashing in his eyes. "Deal." The handshake was brief, firm, and final. The attack came that night. The first gunshot shattered the clinic's front window, sending glass spraying across the waiting room, screams echoing as patients ducked behind chairs, the sharp scent of gunpowder burning through the air. Eric grabbed Linda, shoving her behind the counter as another round of bullets tore through the walls, the heavy thud of footsteps closing in. He moved fast, pushing through the chaos, reaching for the emergency supply cabinet where he had stashed what little protection he had left. Carlos was already moving, his back pressed against the wall, a pistol in his hand, his expression grim. "Told you," he muttered, peering through the broken window. "Vega doesn't talk." Eric didn't answer. He had already guessed this would happen. Jack kicked the back door open, his gun raised, his voice sharp as he took in the scene. "You gonna tell me why there's a goddamn war in your clinic, Eric?" "Later," Eric muttered, his pulse hammering as he spotted movement near the entrance. Vega's men rushed inside, thinking they had the advantage. They were wrong. Carlos moved first, a clean shot taking out the lead attacker's knee, sending him crashing to the floor with a scream. Jack fired next, forcing the others to scatter, ducking behind overturned chairs as bullets slammed into the walls. Eric moved through the smoke, grabbing a fire extinguisher from the counter and slamming it into the nearest attacker's skull, sending the man sprawling. The battle didn't last long. Vega's men weren't prepared for resistance. Minutes later, the last of them stumbled out, dragging their wounded, the sound of sirens in the distance signaling their retreat. Vega wasn't among them. But his message was clear. Carlos wiped blood from his lip, grinning as he looked at Eric. Guess we just pissed him off. Eric exhaled, his knuckles aching, his breath steady despite the wreckage around him. Good. Eric Rains didn't expect to see Carlos Reyes sitting in his clinic, leaning against the examination table like he owned the place, his broad frame relaxed, his hands resting on his knees, but his eyes, sharp, calculating, predatory, watching Eric the moment he stepped inside. Carlos was a ghost from another life, a name that carried weight in the streets, a man who had once stood beside Vega before something had splintered their alliance, turning them from partners to enemies. Eric didn't need to ask why he was here. Carlos exhaled slowly, his fingers tracing an old scar along his forearm, the tension in his body coiled beneath the surface. Didn't think I'd ever need a doctor like you, Doc, he murmured, his voice low, edged with something unreadable. But it looks like we both got problems. Eric crossed his arms, his heartbeat steady, his mind already dissecting the situation. He had spent the last few days playing defense, watching Vega's power tighten like a noose, feeling the weight of a war he hadn't asked for pressing against his ribs. But Carlos being here changed everything. Eric met his gaze, unblinking. What do you want? Carlos smirked, tilting his head slightly. Same thing you do. Vega out of the picture. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his expression unreadable. Man's gotten sloppy. Greedy. Thinks he's untouchable. He chuckled, shaking his head. Nobody's untouchable. Eric didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't let the words settle too quickly. You want him gone, do it yourself? Carlos studied him for a long moment, then let out a low chuckle. If it were that simple, you wouldn't be standing in the middle of a war zone, would you? Silence stretched between them, heavy, charged. Carlos exhaled, rolling his shoulders. I don't need much. Just someone who can patch me up when this all goes sideways. Someone who can keep his mouth shut? Eric let the offer settle, his fingers curling slightly against his forearm. He knew what this was, a devil's bargain, a deal made in the dark, but he also knew the truth. Alone, he couldn't hold Vega back forever. He met Carlos's gaze, his voice steady. You get treatment. No questions asked. No payment. But Vega is mine. Carlos grinned, something sharp flashing in his eyes. Deal. The handshake was brief, firm, and final. The attack came that night. The first gunshot shattered the clinic's front window, sending glass spraying across the waiting room, screams echoing as patients ducked behind chairs, the sharp scent of gunpowder burning through the air. Eric grabbed Linda, shoving her behind the counter as another round of bullets tore through the walls, the heavy thud of footsteps closing in. He moved fast, pushing through the chaos, reaching for the emergency supply cabinet where he had stashed what little protection he had left. Carlos was already moving, his back pressed against the wall, a pistol in his hand, his expression grim. Told you, he muttered, peering through the broken window. Vega doesn't talk. Eric didn't answer. He had already guessed this would happen. Jack kicked the back door open, his gun raised, his voice sharp as he took in the scene. You gonna tell me why there's a goddamn war in your clinic, Eric? Later, Eric muttered, his pulse hammering as he spotted movement near the entrance. Vega's men rushed inside, thinking they had the advantage. They were wrong. Carlos moved first, a clean shot taking out the lead attacker's knee, sending him crashing to the floor with a scream. Jack fired next, forcing the others to scatter, ducking behind overturned chairs as bullets slammed into the walls. Eric moved through the smoke, grabbing a fire extinguisher from the counter and slamming it into the nearest attacker's skull, sending the man sprawling. The air was thick with chaos, with the stench of blood and sweat, the sound of gunfire ringing through the space like a heartbeat. Patients cowered in the corners, shielding themselves from the violence tearing through the one place they thought was safe. Eric clenched his teeth, his muscles burning as he took another man down, twisting his arm until he heard the pop of a dislocated shoulder, the man's scream barely audible over the chaos. Vega's men weren't prepared for resistance. They had come expecting a massacre, expecting fear, expecting to walk in and take whatever they wanted. Instead, they found war. Minutes stretched into an eternity before the last of them stumbled out, dragging their wounded, the sound of sirens in the distance signaling their retreat. Eric stood in the wreckage, his breath steady despite the adrenaline still pounding in his veins, his dark skin slick with sweat, his fingers curled into fists at his sides. Vega wasn't among them. But his message was clear. Carlos wiped blood from his lip, grinning as he looked at Eric. Guess we just pissed him off. Eric exhaled, his knuckles aching, his breath steady despite the wreckage around him. Good. Eric Rains stood in the wreckage of his clinic, his dark skin glistening with sweat, his muscles tense with the weight of what was coming. The attack had been brutal, but it wasn't the end. He knew Vega, knew the man didn't believe in loose ends, didn't accept defiance without punishment. The war had only just begun. His phone buzzed, vibrating against the counter, the number unlisted, the message brief but enough to send ice down his spine. We have her son. Surrender, or he dies. His pulse pounded in his ears as he stared at the image attached. A boy, no older than 7, tears streaking his face, hands bound in his lap, fear in his wide, unblinking eyes. Linda's son. One of his nurses. A single mother who had given everything to this clinic, to these people. Eric clenched his jaw, his breathing slow, controlled, forcing himself to think. Vega had taken this fight to a new level, no more warnings, no more power plays. This was an execution waiting to happen. Jack Morris paced behind him, his voice low, sharp. Eric, listen to me. This is exactly what he wants. He knows you'll break for this kid. Eric didn't move, didn't blink, his mind already working through the impossible choice laid before him. He could surrender, hand over the clinic, hand over his city, let Vega spread his poison unchecked. Or he could let a child die. The weight of it pressed against his ribs, suffocating, tightening like a vice, the same feeling he had known in war zones, standing over bodies, knowing some lives couldn't be saved. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was his home. And he wasn't losing. Carlos leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching. So what's it gonna be, Doc? His voice was flat, emotionless, but his eyes flickered with something, curiosity, calculation. Eric turned, his voice steady, colder than it had ever been. We're going to make Vega choke on his own business. Carlos's brow lifted slightly, but he didn't question it, just waited. Jack exhaled sharply. I don't like that tone. Eric ignored him, grabbing a notepad, writing out a list of chemical compounds, controlled substances, things he knew exactly how to use. Vega's operation depends on one thing: control. He feeds the addicts, keeps them dependent, keeps them scared. We take that away, we take away his power. Carlos let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. You want to mess with his supply? Eric's hands tightened around the pen, his dark eyes steady. Not just mess with it. Poison it. Jack swore under his breath, running a hand through his graying hair. Jesus, Eric, you start killing his customers, you think that's gonna make him back down? Eric turned to him, his voice unshaken. They won't die. Not permanently. He tapped the list. These will trigger seizures, hallucinations, uncontrollable spasms. Just enough to make every single one of his junkies fear for their lives. Carlos whistled low, impressed despite himself. That's some real dark genius, document. Eric didn't respond, his focus already shifting. They had to move fast. The next shipment was coming through in 12 hours. Carlos had the contacts, the knowledge of how Vega's network ran. Eric had the precision, the expertise to make sure the dosage was perfect. Just enough to send a message, just enough to break Vega's stranglehold. They worked in silence, bottles swapped, powders laced, an entire empire about to collapse under its own weight. It took less than a day before the fallout began. The first overdose calls flooded the hospitals, not fatal, but terrifying, people convulsing in the streets, screaming at things that weren't there, their bodies betraying them, the high they'd craved turning into their worst nightmare. Word spread like wildfire. Dealers started refusing to touch the product. Vega's men watched their profits rot in their hands. Fear cracked through the underworld like a fault line, and with it, Vega's control fractured. The phone rang again, but this time, the voice on the other end wasn't gloating. It was shaking. Furious. You think this is a win? You think this saves him? The pause. A sharp breath. You just made your own grave, Doctor. Eric exhaled slowly, gripping the phone tighter. Then come and bury me. Vega felt the walls of his empire cracking, his business bleeding out from the inside, the addicts turning against him, the dealers refusing to push poison product, the fear spreading like wildfire through the streets. He had controlled everything for years, built his kingdom on dependency and violence, but now, because of one man, the foundation was rotting beneath his feet. Eric Rains had gone too far. He hadn't just defied Vega. He had humiliated him, made him look weak in front of his own people, turned his soldiers into cowards, his customers into liabilities. That could not stand. Vega didn't issue warnings anymore. He sent death. The hit came that night. Eric had been waiting for it. The moment the power cut out, he moved, sliding his hand beneath his desk, feeling for the trigger he had wired into the clinic's foundation. The reinforced shutters locked down over the windows, steel plating slamming into place, the sound echoing through the darkened space like the gates of a fortress sealing shut. Jack cursed under his breath, grabbing his gun, already moving toward the back entrance, but Eric grabbed his shoulder, shaking his head. They'll expect that. Instead, they went up. The fire escape rattled under their weight as they climbed to the roof, the bitter night air slamming into them just as the first shots rang out below, automatic fire shredding through the clinic's reception area, bullets tearing through the walls, splintering furniture. Vega's men weren't playing games. They were here to execute. Eric crouched low, motioning for Jack to follow as they slipped across the rooftop, navigating the shadows, their breath steady, measured. Jack grunted, his knee stiff from old wounds, but he kept pace. How many? Eric's voice was quiet, sharp. Jack risked a glance over the ledge, counting silhouettes shifting through the alley, their weapons gleaming under the dim streetlights. Maybe 6. And they're not amateurs. Eric's fingers flexed around the handle of his knife, his mind already working through the next move. He had prepared for this, set traps throughout the building, rewired the doors, rigged the main corridor with pressure-triggered flashbangs. Vega's men thought they were walking into a simple execution. They had no idea they had stepped onto a battlefield. The first explosion was blinding, white light flooding the alley as 2 men stumbled backward, disoriented, their weapons firing wildly into the air. Eric moved before the light faded, dropping over the ledge, landing hard, his knee buckling for only a second before he drove his knife into the nearest attacker's wrist, twisting until the gun clattered to the pavement. The second man recovered too slowly, his vision still swimming from the flashbang, and Jack took the shot, a clean round to the shoulder sending him spinning into the brick wall. Then the third shot rang out. Jack staggered. Eric caught him before he hit the ground, his hands already pressing against the wound, hot blood spilling between his fingers, Jack's breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Damn it, Jack muttered, his jaw clenched, his grip tightening on Eric's arm. I'm fine. He wasn't. But they didn't have time for this. Carlos found them before the next wave hit. He stepped from the shadows, his expression grim, his gun still warm from a recent kill, his eyes locking onto Eric with something unreadable. Vega's done, he said simply. He just doesn't know it yet. Eric's voice was steel. Where's the kid? Carlos exhaled, rolling his shoulders, the tension in his frame betraying the weight of what he was about to say. Warehouse by the docks. But you need to move now. Vega's getting desperate. Eric's hands curled into fists, his body still coiled from the fight, his breath steady despite the fury burning in his chest. He wasn't waiting. 15 minutes later, he was inside the warehouse. The first guard barely had time to react before Eric's elbow crushed his throat, the man dropping soundlessly to the floor. The second went down with a precise strike to the temple, his body crumbling before he could pull the trigger. Eric moved through the shadows, silent, methodical, a ghost slipping between the cracks of Vega's crumbling empire. Then he heard it. A muffled whimper. A child's sob. Eric's pulse slowed, his vision narrowing, his body burning with a single purpose. He found the boy bound to a chair, his small frame trembling, his tear-streaked face buried in his arms. Eric knelt, his voice low, steady. Vega, I got you. The boy looked up, blinking through his fear. And for the first time since this war began, Eric felt something shift. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about ending this. Vega was bleeding power, his empire crumbling, his men deserting, his reputation shattered by the doctor who refused to die. His grip on the city, once unbreakable, was slipping through his fingers, and desperation bred recklessness. He did the only thing he had left. He put a price on Eric Rains. 100 grand, cash, no questions asked. The streets whispered his name, the bounty spreading like wildfire, luring every lowlife, every gun for hire, every desperate punk with an itchy trigger finger into the hunt. The city became a minefield, every alley a trap, every shadow a threat. Eric couldn't walk 2 blocks without eyes on him, couldn't step into his clinic without the weight of a dozen unseen barrels tracking his every move. It was open season, and he was the prize. Jack wanted him to run. You can't fight the whole damn city, he snapped, his arms still in a sling from the last hit. They're coming at you from every angle, and sooner or later, someone gets lucky. Eric just tightened his jaw, the fire in his eyes burning too deep to extinguish. I'm not running, he said, his voice cold, final. This ends tonight. Jack swore under his breath, rubbing a hand over his face, but he didn't argue. He knew that look. There was no turning back. Eric spent the day preparing, mapping out Vega's compound, memorizing guard rotations, noting entry points, blind spots, vulnerabilities. It was a fortress, gated, guarded, layered in security. But security meant predictability, and predictability was weakness. He wasn't walking through the front door. He was slipping through the cracks. By midnight he was inside. The air was thick with cigar smoke, the distant hum of voices, the bass-heavy pulse of music from the upper floors. Vega's men were still loyal enough to guard him, but they weren't looking for a ghost. Eric moved like a shadow, slipping between corridors, hugging blind spots, every step deliberate, every movement calculated. A lone guard leaned against a doorway, half distracted, scrolling his phone. He didn't hear Eric approach. The strike was fast, precise. A sharp twist, a choked breath, a body lowered silently to the floor. Eric pressed forward. The second guard barely had time to register the whisper of movement before a hand clamped over his mouth, a knife pressing against his throat. Eric didn't kill. He incapacitated. A clean strike to the nerve cluster, a body crumpling into unconsciousness. Vega's paranoia had built his defenses high, but it had also isolated him. His best men were dead or gone, his walls thick, his exits few. Eric reached the master suite. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar, the glow of a desk lamp spilling into the hall. He could hear the sound of ice clinking in a glass, the scratch of a lighter, the slow, measured breath of a man still clinging to the illusion of control. Eric stepped inside. Vega looked up, his hand pausing mid-drink, his dark eyes locking onto Eric's. For a second, silence. Then Vega moved. His hand shot toward his desk drawer, reaching for the gun he always kept there, but Eric was faster. He lunged, slamming Vega's wrist against the wood, the gun clattering to the floor. Vega snarled, swinging, but Eric dodged, twisting his arm behind his back, shoving him against the desk, the lamp crashing to the floor in a burst of shattered glass. Game's over, Eric growled, tightening his grip. Vega struggled, cursing, thrashing, but he was pinned, his strength useless against leverage. You want me dead? Eric hissed, his voice low, controlled. You put a price on my head. You sent killers to my clinic. You took a kid. He shoved harder, making Vega grunt. And you lost. Vega spat blood, laughing breathlessly. You think this city gives a damn? You think they'll care what you do to me? Eric pulled out his phone, flipping the camera on. They will now. Vega's face paled, the realization sinking in as the red light blinked. Talk, Eric ordered. And Vega did. By dawn, the video had spread across the city. By noon, the police had him in cuffs. By nightfall, the empire he built was nothing but dust. Vega was in cuffs, dragged out of his fortress in front of cameras, his wrists bound, his face bloodied, the weight of his empire collapsing behind him. The city had watched the confession, seen the fear flicker in his eyes as he admitted to everything. The drugs, the murders, the corruption that stretched into places no one wanted to talk about. The people cheered, the news cycle exploded, the headlines screamed about the fall of a kingpin, and for the first time in years, the streets felt lighter. But Eric knew better. He had seen justice fail too many times to believe in it now. Vega wasn't dead. Vega wasn't finished. And Vega still had power in all the places that mattered. Jack was the first to confirm it. He stormed into the clinic that morning, his face tight with frustration, a file clenched in his fist. "They're trying to cut a deal," he snapped, slamming the papers onto the desk, his voice sharp with disgust. "They want to bury half the charges, throw him a slap-on-the-wrist plea, let him walk in a year or two." Eric didn't look surprised. He just exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening, the exhaustion pressing deeper into his bones. "And you?" Jack let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I told them to shove it." His voice dropped, his shoulders tense. "But it's bigger than me, Eric. Vega's lawyers are pulling strings, making calls, twisting arms. If they can't bribe the right people, they'll threaten them." He met Eric's gaze, his expression dark. "They're not playing by the rules." Neither was Eric. The clinic was still standing, but the war had left its scars. Bullet holes patched up, shattered windows replaced, the waiting room repainted, the blood scrubbed clean. Patients came back, but they moved differently, their voices lower, their eyes scanning the streets before stepping inside. Fear lingered in the air, unspoken but present. Vega might have been locked up, but his shadow was still here, stretching through the city, reaching into places no one could see but everyone could feel. And then, just like that, the fear became real. Vega was out. The news broke in the late afternoon, whispers turning into shouts, the tension snapping through the streets like an electric current. Released on bail, the reporters said, their voices edged with disbelief. Pending trial, the officials insisted, pretending it meant anything. But everyone knew what it really was. Vega had bought his way back into the world, and he wasn't the kind of man who forgave. Eric stood in his office, the phone still in his hand, the weight of the news pressing against his ribs. Jack's voice echoed in his ear, sharp, urgent. "He's coming, Eric. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but you know how this works. He won't let this slide." Eric already knew. He had seen men like Vega before, men who built their power on the idea that they were untouchable, men who would rather burn everything to the ground than admit they had lost. Vega wouldn't let it end like this. He couldn't. The clinic's front door opened, the bell jingling softly, and for a split second, Eric's muscles coiled, his instincts sharpened, expecting the fight to come crashing through. But it was Nia, her face pale, her hands clenched into fists. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear behind it. Eric looked at her, then at the clinic, then at the streets outside, where the city was still holding its breath, waiting for the next move. "We get ready," because Vega was out. And this wasn't over. Vega moved through the streets with fire in his eyes and fury in his blood, convinced that Carlos was the traitor who had orchestrated his downfall, determined to make him pay for every betrayal that had led to the humiliating arrest and the shattering of his empire. The rumor on the block was that Carlos had fled to a rundown hideout by the old train tracks, a place where deals went sour and bodies never got found. So Vega gathered what loyal men he had left and headed there, prepared to spill blood until he got the vengeance he believed he deserved. But the moment he arrived, he sensed that something was off, the perimeter too quiet, the air too still, the night too dark, and when his men fanned out to secure the area, they found nothing but silence. He stepped into the dimly lit warehouse, calling Carlos's name, rage spilling from every syllable, but only echoes answered him, until footsteps thundered behind him, and he turned to see the faces of his own men, cold and resolute, weapons drawn. They told him the truth. They were done carrying his weight, done facing the wrath of the law, done risking everything for a leader whose power had crumbled the moment that damning video hit the airwaves. Vega saw betrayal in their eyes, but he also saw relief, as if they were finally free to sever the last tie binding them to a man who had once been untouchable but had now become a liability. Shots erupted in the darkness, and Vega stumbled. His grand final move turned into a desperate scramble for survival, but his attempts to fight back were useless against the bullet that tore through his chest, sending him to his knees in a swirl of dust and regret. His men left him bleeding on the cold concrete, their footsteps echoing into the emptiness, and within moments, the last vestige of Vega's reign was gone, just another corpse in a forgotten corner of the city. Word spread fast that Vega was dead, and with his death came a collective exhalation, the tension in the air dissolving like a receding storm, the streets beginning to find their footing again. The clinic reopened its doors without fear of retaliation, the bullet holes patched, the windows replaced, the scars still visible but no longer defining. Eric stood at the reception desk, signing off on patient charts, exchanging tired smiles with Linda, who no longer worried that a gang might snatch her child from the parking lot, while Jack leaned against the wall, his arm in a sling but his grin crooked and victorious, satisfied that he hadn't compromised the investigation no matter how many threats came his way. People began to return, step by cautious step, reclaiming the sidewalks, the storefronts, the night air that no longer felt suffocating, and in time they realized that this clinic had stood firm through the violence, becoming a beacon of resistance and hope, a reminder that not every corner of the city was for sale. Eric, though he had never dreamed of being a hero, understood now that sometimes you didn't get to choose your battles, that sometimes the fight claimed you, shaped you, forced you to become something else in order to protect what you loved. On a day that felt calmer than any he remembered, he stepped outside, the sun warm on his face, the hum of distant traffic reassuring rather than ominous, and he saw people approaching, carrying the weight of times, yet hope in their eyes. Eric smiled, victorious.